פודקאסט. טוב, גבירותיי ורבותיי, ברוכות וברוכים הבאים לפודקאסט של הספרים הגדולים, הפודקאסט של Think and Ring Different והמרכז האקדמי שלם. אני ג'רמי פוגל ואנחנו רוצים להתחיל עם רגע של הודעה, לעצם היש, לעצם המציאות הזאת, לעצם הקוסמוס, שמאפשר לנו למרות הכל ובהינתן כל אלה להיפגש כאן, למען הרחבת הדעת, העמקת הידע, גירול אולי סיפוק הסקחנות, אולי רעיון נשגב, מעורר השראה, ככה סתם ככה פתאום וכולנו ביחד ובעברית, או אולי באנגלית היום, כי היום אנחנו עושים פרק באנגלית, גבירותיי ורבותיי, המרכז האקדמי שלם בירושלים. יש מקום כזה, ירושלים, מי שלא שמע, הוא מוסד אקדמי ייחודי לסטודנטים מצטיינים הפועל במודל ה-Liberal Arts בהשראת האוניברסיטאות העילית האמריקאיות, ומעניק השכלה רחבה ומעמיקה בנושאים רבים כמו פילוסופיה, היסטוריה, ספרות, מדעים, יהדות, אסלאם, כלכלה ומחשבה חברתית. בשלם נותנים משקל רב, שימו לב, לקריאה של ספרות מופת ולקריאה של ספרים שלמים, שזה בעיניי רעיון מהפכני. אתה מתחיל את הספר ואתה קורא אותו עד הסוף. רעיון שהיה להם בשלם, וגם הפודקאסט הזה הוא מוקדש כל כולו לספרים הגדולים. Think and Ring Different, הרצאות, רטריטים, thinkdrink.co.il. טוב, גבירותיי, אנחנו היום, וכיף לנו במיוחד, כי אנחנו חוזרים לתקופה שאני מרבה לחשוב עליה בימים האלה, ובזמן הזה אנחנו חוזרים למאה ה-18, אנחנו חוזרים ללומייר, האופקלארונג, ההשכלה, לנאורות. ואני חושב הרבה על הנאורות, כי אני חושב עד כמה מעוררת השחרה היא, עם כל הביקורת המוצדקת, במידה רבה לגיבורים של הנאורות, הביקורת הפוסט-קולוניאלית, הביקורת מסוג כזה ואחר, עד כמה מדהימה הייתה הצלחה של חבורה יחסית קטנה של אינטלקטואלים, של הוגים, שהחליטו להוציא תרבות שלמה לאור, ולהוציא אותה מתחת לכפיפות שלה למוסדות דת, דקניים, פנאטים, אפלים, לעולם חדש, שבסופו של דבר הוביל לעולם המערבי, כמו שאנחנו מכירים אותו היום, הליברלי, הדמוקרטי, ואחד מהגיבורים הגדולים של התקופה, הוא האיש שאנחנו נזכה לדבר עליו היום. אנחנו היום מדברים על לא אחר מאשר אדם סמית, אחד מהגיבורים הגדולים של הנאורות הסקוטית, ועל ספרו האדיר, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, ידוע גם כ-The Wealth of Nations, ואני חושב הספר היחידי האחר בתקופה של הנאורות שאפשר להשוות את הספר הזה מבחינת ההשפעה שלו, זה אולי ביקורת התבונה הטהורה של קאנט. אתם יודעים, בהיסטוריה של הפילוסופיה, כל מה שבא אחרי ביקורת התבונה הטהורה של קאנט הוא פוסט-קנטיאני. ואני מאוד אוהב את ניטשה, מאוד אוהב את שפינוזה, מאוד אוהב את שופנהאואר, אבל כל מה שבא אחרי ניטשה, שופנהאואר, שפינוזה, אי אפשר להגיד שזה פוסט שופנהאוארי או פוסט שפינוזיסטי או פוסט ניטשיאני, אבל כל מה שבא אחרי קאנט הוא פוסט קנטיאני. ואני חושב שבמידה אולי קצת דומה, כל מה שבא אחרי An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, בעולם הכלכלה, בתחום הכלכלה, ואולי בכלל בתחום הבנת האדם, הוא פוסט סמית'יאני באיזושהי צורה, ועל הספר האדיר הזה, על ההשפעות שלו, על הטיעונים שלו, אנחנו נזכה לדבר עם אורח מיוחד, חייבים לומר, כי אנחנו כאן היום בירושלים, במרכז האקדמי שלם, עם לא אחר מאשר הנשיא של המרכז האקדמי שלם, גבירותיי ורבותיי, פרופסור רוברטס. פרופסור רוברטס, פעם הוא היה כמוכם, אם אתם תלמידים לתואר ראשון, או אם אתם צעירים ששוקלים ככה להצטרף למרכז האקדמי שלם המדהים כאן בירושלים. הוא למד כלכלה באוניברסיטה של נורת' קרוליינה, את התואר שני ושלישי, את הדוקטורט, הוא עשה באוניברסיטי אוף שיקגו, ששם הוא חקר את הכלכלה הפוליטית, או Political Economy of Government Welfare Programs, הוא לימד באוניברסיטה של רוצ'סטר, באוניברסיטת סטנפורד, באוניברסיטת UCLA, בוושינגטון אוניברסיטי של סנט לואיס, בג'ורג' מייסון, עד שהוא הצטרף להובר אינסטיטושן בסטנפורד, רקורד אקדמי, סטלר רקורד אקדמי, אקדמיק רקורד כמו שאומרים באנגלית, והיום כמובן שהוא הנשיא של המרכז האקדמי שלם קולג' here in Jerusalem. אנחנו ככה בהדרגה עוברים לאנגלית, אני עושה את זה בהדרגה. מבין ספריו, אולי נציין רק את הספרים שקיבלתי מתנה, אני קיבלתי כאן מתנות היום, How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life, An Unexpected Guide to Human Nature and Happiness, שיצא, בוא נראה, איפה הוא יצא? בפורטפוליו פנגווין, A Parable of Possibility and Prosperity, שיצא בפרינסטון, ומדובר על בעצם רומן שמלמד כלכלה, Wild Problems, A Guide to the Decisions That Define Us, רוברטס, שיצא בפנגווין שוב. פרופסור רוברטס הוא לא רק אקדמאי, הוא גם בעצם סוג של יזם ראפ, חייבים לומר. הוא ראפר, הוא סוג של ראפר, רוברטס, בגלל שהווידאו שלו, ואני מציע לכולם ללכת, עכשיו מיד, לעשות פוז, ללכת ליוטיוב, קיינס הייק ראפ, K-E-Y-N-E-S, H-A-Y-E-K, ראפ, ואתם תראו שם את שיר ראפ של פרופסור רוברטס, מיליוני צפיות. עכשיו, אני רוצה שאנחנו נתחיל ככה לצפות, כי מסיבות שלא ניכנס אליהם חשוב שנעבור את קישה. אנחנו רוצים לעבור את קישה בצפיות, זה איזשהו סוג של עניין פנימי כזה. הפודקאסט של פרופסור רוברטס הוא איקון טוק, 900 פרקים. 900 פרקים, גבירותיי ורבותיי, זה התלמוד של הפודקאסטים בכלכלה, בין האורחים, עכשיו אני סתם אזרוק כמה שמות, מילטון פרידמן, יובל נוח הררי, סם הריס, מרת'ה נוסבורן, אנג'לה דוקוורת, כריסטופר היצ'נס, need I say more, כן? אז זה הפודקאסט איקון טוק, שאתם יכולים למצוא כמובן בכל הפלטפורמות. טוב, ניכר שהולך להיות מעניין, ועכשיו אנחנו עוברים לאנגלית. פרופסור רוברטס, שלום רב.
תודה. זה introduction, it's going to be impossible to live up to that introduction. It was so magnificent. Fortunately, I didn't understand every word, but I understood some of it. I'm pretty sure some of it was true.
Well, let's go straight for the jugular. And, you know, because I like to talk myself into various holes and barrels. Let's go straight to the jugular. This book that we're talking about today, written by one of the heroes of the Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Smith. Who was Adam Smith?
Adam Smith was born in 1723. We're not sure of the exact day, but this year is the 300th anniversary of his birth.
Mazel tov.
He lost his father very young. I always forget whether it was right before he was born or just right after he was born. I think right, can't remember. But he basically grew up without a father. He spent his life mostly in his armchair, trying to understand the world. At some point in his life, a British duke, the Duke of Buccleuch, hired him to tutor his son. And at that point, Adam Smith was a famous economist, not an economist because there really weren't any then, but a writer about economics and a professor. He left Scotland and was in Europe. He met some of the great thinkers of Europe. But probably the most important thing about him that you will care about is his best friend. His best friend was David Hume.
Yes.
And they had a beautiful friendship that I write about in my book. When Hume died, Smith wrote a letter to his publisher, their mutual publisher, and described their friendship and what was special about Hume as a human being. And it's something to aspire to either be a friend like that or to be a human being like that. He only wrote 2 books in his lifetime. An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, which you mentioned, and The Theory of Moral Sentiments, his lesser-known book, but still a great masterpiece of philosophy, moral philosophy. And he spent the last 12 years of his life living with his mother and in Panmure House. You can go visit that in Edinburgh. And ironically, perhaps, he was a customs inspector in the last years of his life. The greatest free trader of all time was involved in collecting tariffs and making sure that people weren't smuggling into England. We can talk about that if you want. But the most important thing to know about him is he only wrote 2 books, but they're 2 of the most influential books ever written. And I would say with The Wealth of Nations, which we will call it maybe for this conversation to save a little time, its full title, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, it really launched. It gets credited with launching economics, but it really launched social science. He was a man of tremendous curiosity. He was interested in economics, psychology, history, philosophy, astronomy, science generally. I think the book's very wide-ranging. To put it into a little more context, Adam Smith was a child and alive when Isaac Newton was alive. So Isaac Newton died, I think, when Smith was 5 or 6 years old. And it's hard to remember what a transformative person Isaac Newton was. Yes, he was maybe one of the 2 greatest physicists of all time, but his impact on the thinkers of his day must have been extraordinary, way beyond physics. He identified a hidden force, gravity, that held our world together. And I think that deeply influenced Smith and his contemporaries. And we see in both of his books a focus on the unseen, forces, cultural and economic forces that shape the world that we live in, but that are not so tangible, that are not readily touched and measured. And Smith, in the case of The Wealth of Nations, was interested in why nations prosper, and he's writing right at the beginning, the very, very beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. It's 1776 when this masterpiece, this great work, comes out. And it's ironic because he's writing a book about nations getting wealthy. There aren't that many wealthy nations, and they're not getting that much wealthier. In 1776, the average human being was not much wealthier than they were 1776 years before. Most people were living in the world at a subsistence level. They were farmers, and we're on the cusp, the beginning of what is going to transform the world in an extraordinary, explosive time of economic growth for the next 250 years. So that's what the first book's about. The first book is about, why do nations prosper? Why are some nations prosper and others are poor? His answer is unique, quite special, and still remains true and worth understanding. And in his second book, which is actually his first and his second book, first and his second book, as you'll see, he first published The Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759, so well before it was his first book. But he revises it 6 or 7 times during his life, and the last edition comes out, I think, in 1789 or 1790, the year of his death. So it's both before The Wealth of Nations, but in a sense, it's after it as well. And that book is answering the question, why do people do nice things for each other? We're self-interested. We are dominated by our self-love. We're not selfish, but didn't think we were selfish. He gets caricatured like that often. But we care mostly about ourselves. We put ourselves first inevitably. How do we make room for the other people around us? Because we do. And he wanted to understand that, and he answers that question without invoking parents, religion, the standard ways that people of his day explained why people do the right thing, or that it's in their nature, that they're compassionate. Smith didn't believe that. He thought that we have a little bit of compassion in us, but not a lot. So despite that, he wants to explain why is it that we often will do what we would call acts of altruism or empathy. And his answer there is also profound and also very special. So he writes very clearly. You can still read him. There are a lot of people who wrote in the 18th century that are very difficult to read. He is not that. It's hard for a non-native English speaker a little bit, but he's accessible to a modern reader. He has a sense of humor, and he writes beautifully, and he's still with us. His impact is still being felt.
So maybe before we delve into his answer as to why some nations might be wealthier than others, etc., and the way in which this book becomes constitutive to the field of economy and social science more widely, perhaps you do describe what the field was like when he comes into it. So what was economic thinking like before Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations?
There's very little of it. I don't think there's any formal field of called economics. There are people writing about what we would call economics. The dominant economic theory of his day before he came along is known as mercantilism. Mercantile means related to commercial things, related to money. So the mercantilism theory was, and this goes back probably 400 or 500 years before Smith, probably to the 14th century, 13th century. The mercantile theory was the way a nation gets rich is by having gold, because gold is the ultimate value, or silver. And the nations that get rich have lots of it. And so the goal of economic policy is to accumulate gold. And the way you do that is you keep out trade, because trade can take out your gold. And Smith had a crazy idea. He said, actually, gold is metal. Metal is not useful. What we actually care about as human beings is our command over goods and services. And it turns out wealth is not gold. Wealth is the ability to enjoy things and services. And the way you do that actually is by trading with your neighbor, not by keeping your stuff to yourself. So his deepest insight is that trade, both what we would call domestically, meaning the person across the street or the person around the corner or the person on the other side of your country, that's domestic trade, or more importantly, international trade, trading with other countries, is the road to prosperity. And how that comes about isn't simply trade, but it's important to say at the beginning that he's a free trader, more or less. There's a few footnotes, but then people have tried to emphasize the footnotes, but he's overwhelmingly fighting this view that says the secret to getting wealthy is to keep stuff out of your country that comes from elsewhere. And he said the opposite. He said the secret to becoming wealthy is to open your borders to trade. I think he's right in general and almost every time on that point. And then one more, since we're on this point, and then we can go back to whatever background you want. The secret to trading successfully is specialization and the division of labor. And he understood profoundly, there were other people writing about this at the time, but he understood profoundly that the division of labor, that specialization allows growth. And it allows you to do things you could not do if you had to do everything for yourself. It's a fantastic lesson for public policy. We live in a small country, Israel. There are many, many things we import. And if we decided to produce them domestically, we would have more jobs in those activities, but we'd have many fewer jobs elsewhere, and we would be poorer overall. But the other piece of it that is so profound is that he understood that if you are trading with lots of people, say 8 billion, instead of just your village, you can specialize and get really, really good at something. And he understood that whatever you're good at now, you can get a lot better if you specialize at it, and thereby trade for the things you desperately want and need rather than having to make them for yourself. That's the lesson for national policy. But for your personal life, it also has a lesson, which is that sometimes it's too expensive to make things for yourself, and you should buy them rather than make them. We all do this intuitively. Most of us, we might bake bread. My wife is a phenomenal baker of bread. My children, sons and daughter, are phenomenal bakers of bread. But it's a hobby. It's fun. They do it because they love it. They don't do it to put food on the table. Otherwise, you buy your bread because you're too ineffective at it. You're not good enough. So understanding that there's some things that the way I word it, self-sufficiency is the road to poverty. It's good to be self-sufficient in the sense that you take care of yourself. But if that's all you do, if all you do is rely on yourself for everything, you will be very, very poor. So what Smith understood is that the modern world that we live in is the product of an extraordinary web of interaction, commercial exchange, what we call trade, and driven by this underlying idea of specialization and the division of labor. And it's what describes our world, the world we live in.
So would you say that the first step to begin to understand Smith's argument is, in a sense, a redefining of the notion of wealth? So instead of having a hoarding notion of wealth, let's hoard as much gold, silver, and diamonds as we possibly can put our hands on, we start to define wealth differently in terms of the services we can enjoy and in terms of a notion, it seems, of quality of life, in a sense.
Yeah,
Could you perhaps elaborate on his definition of wealth?
Yeah, so, you said, I think you start to say, in the original view that other people had, you hoarded money and diamonds, jewels, whatever. And what Smith was saying is that we don't care about the money per se. We don't care about the money in and of itself. We care about what the money can do for us. And of course, what money can do for us has to get you into the question of the quality of life, because it's not about who can have the most toys, who can consume the most. It's about who can have the richest life, where richest doesn't mean just how many zeros are in your income or in your bank account, but in the day-to-day delight and joy and everything else we get. It's really important to emphasize the depth and breadth of Smith's understanding of the human experience. He gets parodied, caricatured as the champion of greed, of the pursuit of money. Yet in his other book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, he says the pursuit of wealth will corrupt you. It's a fool's game. Don't do it. It's the wrong way to have a meaningful life. So he's not obsessed with money. He's not obsessed with income. He's not obsessed with wealth. He's not obsessed with business. He's obsessed with what is a meaningful life. And to cut to the chase, to give the punchline, his definition of real happiness, and by happiness he meant deep contentment, serenity. His ultimate definition is that you are respected, admired, and praised by the people around you. You have earned that respect. And he says, as human beings, what we care about is that people pay attention to us. We care about that people respect us. We care about that people admire and praise us. But more than that, we want to earn those things honestly. He says, man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely. And what he means by that is loved, meaning respected, admired, and praised. Lovely, worthy of respect and praise. And he says that's what happiness is when you feel you matter. And that's a profoundly different view than the way a modern economist, tragically in my view, looks at happiness. We call it utility, and we say utility is a function of how much stuff you can have. And it's true. Stuff is nice. We do like stuff. But a good economist understands, and Smith was a very good economist, that it's not all we care about. So I think it's really important to say that early, that Smith is not obsessed, even though he understood that gold and silver is not the road to true wealth. He also understood that stuff was not the road to true wealth.
So even the goods and services that which he took to be wealth are not the highest value in human life.
Absolutely. And the econ jargon for stuff is consumption, meaning the real wealth of a nation is its ability to consume, its ability to enjoy things, food, clothing, shelter, health, and also services, haircuts and vacations and travel and so on. But more than that, there's something even deeper, which of course is the respect of the people around us and the people who we care about.
From what you're saying, it's clear that for anyone to be considered a good economist, he first of all has to be to have a profound or insightful understanding of human nature and of what human beings are like and what they value. You always an answer about the theory of moral sentiments, and that is why and how we find space for others, for altruism, in spite of us being driven, firstly by self-preservation and self-interest.
So I've hinted at it already, which is, he starts with an amazing parable at the beginning of the Theory of Moral Sentiments. He says, suppose there is an earthquake in China, and millions of people die. He said, if you hear about that, remember in Smith's day, they didn't have cable television, they didn't have many newspapers, and if they did, news came weeks later. There's no smartphone. So you hear, you see in the newspaper, a friend writes you a letter weeks afterward, oh, did you hear that in China, 1 million people are dead? He said, you'll go, oh, that's terrible. That's a terrible tragedy. You have some business in China, and you might think, I wonder where the earthquake was. I hope my business dealings are okay. He said, but then you'll sleep like a baby. In my retelling of it, I say, you might give some charity. You might give to a fund that's helping to help the victims. And in our day, literally our day this week, terrible tragedies recently in Libya. Thousands of people are dead. How much sleep did you lose over that? It's sad. We all felt some sadness, but we sleep okay, for better or for worse. That's, Smith would say, that's who we are. We have trouble caring deeply about people who are far away from us. And I would say it's true even if you see some of it on television or on your computer. And then he says, okay, so, okay. He said, but let's suppose I tell you that tomorrow you're going to have surgery and your little finger is going to be removed. You're not going to be able to sleep. You're going to be a wreck. So what's going on there? He said, explicitly, you care more about your little finger than 1 million people in China. And yet, and this is the punchline, because at that point people say, yeah, Smith, terrible person, cares more about, he says, you care more about your little finger? I think he's right in some dimension. But the next part's the key part. Smith says, okay, so now I give you a deal. You can save your little finger, but 1 million people are going to die in China. Would you do it? He said, no one would do that. Well, maybe some monster, but he says, no one is so monstrous. And I think most people would agree with him and would not do it. And even the next flip side of that, if you could save 1 million people in China, would you give up your little finger? Many people would say, yes, I'll be there in the morning. How is that? Wait a minute, Smith says. You just told me you feel more strongly about your little finger than 1 million deaths of strangers. And yet, when faced with the decision of what to do in the world, you would not save your little finger and kill 1 million people. Wow, that seems inconsistent. And so it says, so what's the difference? What happens there? He says two things. It's a subtle thing. They're a little bit different. He says, first, he says, well, you know that if you killed 1 million people to save your little finger, you would be despised by everyone you know. You would lose all your friends. They would think the horrible things about you. So first of all, he says, again, the reputation we have with the people around us affects how we behave. That's the first thing. But then the second thing is so deep and so difficult. He says, but we also care how we see ourselves. He says he calls it the man in the breast. He's writing in 1759. It's sexist language, but the person, yourself, your sense of self. Sometimes he calls it the impartial spectator. The person on the outside looking at you, that's the first case, who says, who would do such a thing? And would judge you brutally if you did. He says, you care about that person. You use that idea to decide what's the right thing to do because you want that respect of the people around you. But he then says this crazy idea that you have an impartial spectator inside you. You have your own self-image, and you care about that. So you want to be both loved, that is, you want the people around you to respect you, but you also want to have self-respect. You want to be lovely. Now, that's a little bit idealistic, romantic, absurd, because he actually does deeply understand that we lie to ourselves all the time.
Right.
We find excuses. He has a whole section on how we excuse ourselves and do terrible things, and we still manage to respect ourselves because we don't like to see ourselves as bad, as immoral. And so there's this tension that Smith is writing about, which is, I want to be a good person because I want the people around me to respect me. And I want to be a good person because I want to respect myself. So even when no one is watching, I am, right? When I find the money on the street and I don't know who it belongs to, but no one's looking, do I return it? If there's a wallet and a name, do I return it to the owner or do I keep it if no one's looking? And Smith's answer, a religious answer is, well, God's looking, and that's what keeps us from doing the wrong thing. And maybe it works sometimes. But Smith's answer is, you're looking at yourself, and you're saying, do I want to see myself as the kind of person who would take money from a stranger and not return it? Of course, some people do, but a lot of people do the right thing. And Smith's answer is, why would you ever do that? Why would you ever give up the chance to keep the money? And the answer is, because you want self-respect.
So would you say that the reason why, in Smith's eyes, we are also inclined, in spite of our drive for self-interest, to active altruism, is that notion of self-respect and that self-judgment, that conscience?
So he's trying to he's trying to give us an idea of
what I'm maybe aiming at. I should do it more explicitly. What about feelings of compassion? What about feelings of mercy? What about sympathy? What about love for others?
Yeah, he calls that a weak reed to lean on. A reed meaning a tall blade of grass, which is blowing in the wind. You can't lean on it at all. He doesn't believe that's very strong. It's there. It's not strong though. It's not. He does think we have sympathy. He's one of the earliest, if not the earliest writer on this idea that when you're in pain, now we know the scientific basis for this, that I can feel your suffering. We now know it's mirror neurons in our brain that help us imagine and sense pain, even when it's not happening to us. He understood that from just intuitively. He didn't know the scientific basis for it. He knew that happened. But that's not enough to get me to do the right thing. If I'm suffering a little or I can imagine you're suffering, it's not enough to get me to do the right thing. So what he's trying to say is that our conscience does keep us in line, but where does that come from? It doesn't come from your parents. It doesn't come from God or religion, organized religion, which made him controversial in his time. It comes from our own hardwired, a word he would not have used, but it is the right term. It's innate. It is built into us. It is built into us to care how we're viewed by others. So he's basically saying we're social creatures, and we care to. If you want to be totally pragmatic, if we're going to be successful in the world, we have to work with other people, either in business or in social community, all kinds of ways, fun. And to do that, you have to earn the respect of the people around you. But more than that, you grow to care about how you see yourself.
But would you think from your own experience and reflection, you talked about the bakers in your family, your wife, your children. Would you say that you try to be a loving husband or a loving father out of a quest for self-respect, or just out of feelings of love towards your wife, your children?
Well, I hope it's love, but the real question is, it's not an answerable question. Where does that love come from? Yes, we have emotional connections to other people, but I think they develop. I don't know what Smith would, if he writes it, he probably writes about it. I don't remember. So I don't want to suggest, and I don't think Smith believed, that all of our interactions with each other are transactional, meaning, I'm being nice to you, so you'll respect me, and then we'll be able to work together. That's not what I'm saying. Right. He's saying we're hardwired. We are innately in our nature aware of how we're viewed, and that allows us to then view ourselves from the outside, which allows us to create an image and identity of what kind of person we are. How much of our own innate compassion, chesed v'rachamim, I guess would be the Hebrew words, how much of that is built into us? Not zero, Smith would say, but it's not the driver.
Do you find that convincing? Do you agree with him?
I don't know, but I would say, I think this is, I've heard this said, I don't know if it's true, you maybe you can tell me, but the root of ahava is to give. Now, of course, it's not the simplest word for giving, but I think it's true that the givers often love more than the receivers. That we come to love the people we help, not so much the people we are helped by. Our intuition is the opposite. Our intuition is, the person who helped me, of course I love them. But that person is often the person we struggle to love because we're dependent on them. The person we give to, the giver, is, I think, often it's easier to be the one who loves. So as a father who has given a lot to my 4 children in terms of time and effort and pain and
blood, sweat, and tears.
Yeah, diapers and dinners.
Diapers and dinners.
I think part of the reason I love them is biological. It's can't be understood other than just it's built in. Part of it is I've given them so much, and I don't mean that as like like I'm a martyr or some kind of suffering person. But the act of giving, I think, reinforces whatever biological love there is to start with. Friendship maybe is a little bit different, right? I already like you, Jeremy. I've known you for an hour. You have great style. You have clearly a good sense of humor. You have a delightful delivery as a podcaster. And so I like you. Where's that come from? I'm not liking you because I think it'll get me somewhere or it's good for me or it's a biological thing going on there. But we
get along fine. And then you gave me the books.
I gave you 3 of my books. Right. So the question is, who loves each other more now because that gift? Me because I gave them, or you because you accepted them?
Well, first of all, in this case, I'm extremely happy and I'm thankful and not only the books, I received a view into a whole new world of rap, which I wasn't aware of and which I'm still blown away from or by. But notice that in all these categories that you mentioned, for example, in the reason why you love your children, well, it's biological, it's the giving, it's the one thing you did not note is that in virtue of your relationship with them, your self-image is lovely, right? Not only beloved, but lovely. And that seems to be the main drive, the main psychological drive that Adam Smith suggests.
Say that again.
You mentioned the biological innate kind of love we have for family. You mentioned this thing which I think has been backed up by research in modern times, that giving makes us more loving, that the giver loves more than the person who receives. But you did not mention what is for Adam Smith so critical, which is our own self-image. You could say, well, the reason why I love my children so much is by virtue of our very happy relationship. I have a self-image of as someone who's a good father.
It's a great question. It's subtle, I think a subtle point about language. You asked me why I love my children. You didn't ask me why I treat them well. So I'm always interested in self-sacrifice. I find it fascinating, like Smith. And in family life, children, there's no limit to how much time you can spend with your children. You have your work, and you have this thing called work-life balance. Well, it's easy to start pushing that balance toward work because, I'm really working for the kids. This is what Smith would notice. It's very easy for us to make this deceit. So I stay late at the office every night, but that's so I can earn enough money so they can go to a good college, so I can give them lessons, music lessons, and so on. So the real question is why do I sometimes, I hope often when they were growing up, why did I come home early? Why did I go to all of those baseball games, football games, English football, American soccer? I went to track meets. I went to science fairs. Why did I spend all that time with my kids? and spent time playing baseball with them in the backyard or taking them fishing or all that time. Now, part of it was fun. I enjoyed it, a lot of it, but not every minute. There were times when I did it out of obligation. Why did I do that? I felt it was the right thing to do. And that's a fancy way of saying I wanted my self-image as a father to coincide with what I thought a father should be.
Right.
And I think that's the Smithian insight.
Right.
So why is it that I devoted time to my children? Yes, I love them. Yes, I care about them. But why did I devote time to them? Partly because I loved them. Partly because I thought they would turn into people I would like to be around. Very transactional, right? But some of it was I felt it was an obligation. It was the right thing to do. And where did that come from? My self-image, and also I wanted the respect of my wife, right? And the people. When I talked about the people around me, she was quite important, and my neighbors, and so on, and my other family members. But Smith understood that drive to be respected is important. I think it's really important in the modern time, in our times. When we look at some of the challenges America's having right now, less so here, but God willing, it won't come here, but it could easily come here because many viruses spread from west to east. There's a lot of people in America who don't feel respected, who lost their job because of economic change, get involved with drugs. In America, it's called deaths of despair. Where's that despair coming from? The tragedies of gun violence in America, mass shootings, young people and older people who take a gun and kill as many strangers as they can. What's happening there? And a lot of people look at gun laws and they are relevant for the conversation, but the underlying driver, I think, of many of these challenges are that people don't feel like anyone's noticing. They feel ignored. They feel they don't matter, and they don't have family. And one of the things we're blessed with here in Israel that you notice when you come here, I'm an Ola Chadash, I came here 2 years ago. Family is much more important in Israel than it is in America. People are much more family-oriented. And in America, people who don't have family have lost their jobs. They're searching for meaning, and they're struggling to find it. So
if we carry that insight of the theory of moral sentiments, as in the importance of to be loved and to be lovely also, so not only that other people respect me, but that I can have self-respect. How does that feed into the book we are talking about, The Wealth of the Nations? How would you say that like cardinal insight about human psychology feeds into his economic theory?
I got bad news for you, Jeremy. It doesn't.
No.
Not much. And so little that there was a whole literature in the 19th century, mostly coming out of Germany, called the Adam Smith problem. How is it that the same person could write The Wealth of Nations and the Theory of Moral Sentiments? Why is that a puzzle? Because the Theory of Moral Sentiments is about how much we care about what other people think about us and how our self-interest is tempered by our social environment. There's no mention of that in this other book, The Wealth of Nations. And in fact, I think George Stigler called it, a professor at the University of Chicago who loved Adam Smith and wrote much on him. He calls The Wealth of Nations an edifice, meaning like a cathedral or a palace constructed out of self-interest without relying on any of the other things. And in fact, the way the invisible hand, a phrase we haven't used yet, but the way that the invisible hand is usually used in modern economics is self-interest by itself can achieve many things without external regulation and government oversight. And that self-interest alone can help other people, can cause you to help other people. So famous line from The Wealth of Nations is, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher and the baker that we get their products, but from their self-interest. They're trying to make a living. They're in competition with other butchers and bakers. And the reason the baker gets up at 4 a.m. is not because they love their customers. The bakers get up at 4 a.m. because if they don't, they're going to lose customers to their competitor who's going to get up at 4 a.m. and who has fresher bread and better croissant and better challah and better bagels. And so in The Wealth of Nations, Smith is going to say, he's really asking the question, how far can I push self-interest to explain what I see in the world around us? Take a modern, not so modern, 100 years after Smith, a great writer of economics, Frederick Bastiat. He asked the question, how is it that in Paris, everybody sleeps well at night, knowing the next day there's going to be plenty of bread, when no one's in charge of the bread supply for Paris? Take Jerusalem. Tomorrow we're going to wake up. You might decide to throw a party and invite a bunch of people over, and you're going to serve pita, and you're not worried there's not going to be enough pita in the store. There's always plenty. Who's in charge of that? Who's in charge of the flour? That question, Smith answers through self-interest, combined with competition, very important. Self-interest by itself can lead to exploitation. Self-interest with competition forces me to serve the customer, even if I'm not benevolent, even if I'm not empathetic, even if I'm not kind. And you can be. A good baker, I think, gets joy from feeding the customers. A good capitalist, the good person acting in the business world, should not just enjoy the money, they should also enjoy that they're making people's lives better if their products are worth buying. But what Smith did in this book is insane. Even though he wrote the first book on how much we care about what other people think of us, he wrote the second book asking the question, how far can I explain the world around me without having to without having to use these ideas about social connections and how much we care about them? And I want to give you an answer to how the same person could write both those books.
A solution to the Smith problem.
Exactly. Now, I write about it in my book, but as I've gotten older, I have I think, a better answer. I think I either stole it or it grew from a conversation I had with Vernon Smith, no relation to Adam, a Nobel laureate I've interviewed a few times on my podcast, and I've talked to him in other settings. And this comes back to the Newton idea. So the way I think about it is the following. So Newton is concerned with harmony. Harmony, English word that sometimes means singing beautifully in ways that sound special. Choir, or just two people singing in ways that are pleasant to the ear. It's called, in English, the verb is to harmonize, to sing well with another person, or to get along well with another person. Harmony is about the conjunction of events. So in the heavens, which was Newton's concern, he was interested in the harmony of the heavens. How did the planets stay together? How did the planets stay in orbit around the sun? This is a puzzle, right? There's no strings. Newton believed in God, but he didn't believe that God put out his hand and made sure the planets stayed in the right place. And what was his answer? Gravity. So gravity is the unseen force that holds the solar system together. And so I think Smith saw that, and he applied it in both of his books, but in a different way. In The Wealth of Nations, he's looking at what is the hidden thing that holds our commercial world together, our interaction with strangers. That is self-interest and competition. Those things make it sure that when I go into the store tomorrow morning to buy pita, there's pita there. I don't have to call ahead and say, I need 6 tomorrow, or worse. In 2 weeks, I'm going to throw a birthday party. I'm going to need 36 pita. So how does that work with no one in charge? And Smith's answer was that hidden harmony, that we can all interact, buy what we want, not call in advance, find things on the shelf in a modern economy, even in his time. The hidden harmony came from self-interest and competition. We call that now the invisible hand. Smith didn't call the invisible hand that. That's another discussion, but it's okay to call it that. The invisible hand is an unseen force that holds things together or provides things.
So the term invisible hand is not one that Smith himself coined, used, or referred to?
He did. He used it twice in these books, one time in The Wealth of Nations, one time in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and neither of those does it mean what we call it to mean in today's world. The caricature of the invisible hand is, oh, you don't need government for anything. It's everything private. Capitalism solves all problems. That's not true. The invisible hand, that is letting capitalism do its thing by itself without regulation, works horribly in certain areas. It leads, you can have pollution, you can have dishonesty, you can have cartels. Or
you can have people that are denied healthcare or education.
Well, they wouldn't be denied healthcare. They might not be able to afford it.
Right.
Which Smith would have, I think, have something to say about that. Wouldn't be the same thing you're thinking, Jeremy, but we can come back to it if you want. But the point, what you're right about for sure, and Smith would recognize, is that there's going to be inequality. There's going to be rich people and not rich people, and they're going to be rich people and often poor, not just not rich, but actually poor. But the idea is that the idea that we don't have to monitor everything going on in the economy for it to be successful is a mystery. And the answer to that mystery is self-interest combined with competition.
So we talked about Newton and the great admiration, right? And this is something he shares with Kant, of course. The great admiration for Newton and this quest to find the hidden force that keeps all things together. You say competition and self-interest. And which now we use the word invisible hand for, but that might not have been exactly what Smith used the term for. And I was wondering about that notion, and maybe the example of healthcare in some sense is a useful example, because if we think of the paradigm of the world that Smith created in a way, or at least reflected in his thought, the modern capitalist world, and this idea that, you know, the market evens itself out. And, you know, I have a very little understanding about economy, but I know what I like and I know what I don't like. You know, it's like with wine. I don't have a very great theoretical understanding, but I know what I like. And what I don't like is this, it seems to me that there's a mythological aspect to the sense of the market evening itself out, and the market, you know, the hidden hand being smarter than whatever regulators could have in mind. Because if I look at, you know, I grew up in Europe, if I look at the American healthcare system, where the hidden hand is hiddenly doing its thing, people pay huge amounts. I found that very unjust.
I agree.
That
it's a disaster.
That if you have a kid that's born, God forbid, you know, with a disease, that means that if you're a middle class family, your life essentially is over. And so this notion that the hidden hand will always even things out, and that this is a force we should rely on, it seems to me is mythological, and maybe it's descriptive, but I wonder whether it's prescriptive. I wonder whether it's something we should oppose. Really.
I think it's pretty prescriptive in some areas. You could debate whether it's prescriptive in healthcare, but we're about to go into an enormous rabbit hole, is what we'd say in English. Is there a Hebrew equivalent of rabbit hole, going down the rabbit hole?
Avishag, you tell us. Mechilat ha'arnav. There's only one tzabarit here today, right? We're two olim chadashim.
We can talk as much about healthcare as you want, but that's
just an example for the notion that it doesn't work as well as it might sound.
Okay, so first of all, in 1960, so 2 to 3 generations ago in the United States, every dollar of healthcare, I think it was about between 60 and 70 cents of that dollar, so 2/3, let's say roughly, of the dollar came out of the pocket of the patient. In America today, I think that, I'm going to guess, I don't know exactly, that number is about 20 cents. It's about 1/5 of a dollar. As a result of that, people in healthcare are spending other people's money, either as patients or as doctors. There's nothing close to a private. The healthcare system in the United States is not an Adam Smith ideal. It's heavily regulated by government, and some of that regulation is why it's expensive. Just to take one example, the pharmaceutical industry is unbelievably profitable, and some of that's good because it creates an incentive to find new drugs. And a lot of it's horrible because it encourages doctors to give away and prescribe drugs that are not particularly better or helpful, but because of government regulation, they have to prescribe the best drug, even if all it does is extend life an extra, say, month on average. If it costs literally $100,000 more a year, then they prescribe it, and then the government program for the elderly, Medicare pays for it, and that's a disastrous cycle of waste.
But you would argue, like you would agree with Adam Smith that self-interest and competition are the best ways.
No, I think you can't have a general rule. I would say they are powerful ways to organize economic activity. And what Smith, I think, would say, it's always a little unfair because he's not here, is that should be your default. That should be your starting place. There are many cases where it's not true. But I want to take an example closer to home. It's a little expensive to live in Tel Aviv. I think you live in Tel Aviv, right?
Yes.
So is that a failure of the invisible hand or of government regulation? Is that because greedy, self-interested landlords and real estate owners have been allowed to run amok, to run free? Or is maybe there's some government part of that problem in terms of, say, allowing people to build new houses, new apartment buildings? I think it's complicated. So
I would say both.
I'm sure it's both. Even worse, part of the reason the government has made it hard to build a new building in Tel Aviv is because they're friends with the people who own the land that's already earning a lot of money, and they fight and tell their government officials to leave it alone. So that's what I call crony capitalism, not the real thing. But I recognize the fact that once you get into that world, that cronyism is very hard to stop. So it's very complicated. A lot of situations that we don't like the outcome are usually a result, I think, of some government attempt, often with good intentions. Case of Tel Aviv, not good intentions, I think. I think they're actually making happy the people there who have political power, the owners of property. You know, it happens in every place in the world, tragically. Rice is very expensive in Japan, the most important food product in Japan. I think it's 4 to 7. I don't remember the multiple. It's 4 to 7 times more expensive in Japan than the United States. If you ask Japanese people why that's true, they'll say, well, our rice is very high quality, and the government has to keep out the foreign rice that would degrade the quality of this national treasure. My explanation is the people who grow rice in Japan have a lot of friends in high places in government. When my students in America my Japanese students would come to America, one of the biggest surprises they would tell me is that, hey, American rice is pretty good. I thought it was going to be horrible after all the stories I heard. So it's complicated. I think without debating where the invisible hand works well and where it doesn't, I think it's useful just to realize how important it is to understand that anything works well without regulation is amazing. By the way, it doesn't mean anarchy. When I say without regulation, property rights are important, and the government's very good at enforcing property rights. It's very important that the government have courts to adjudicate and deal with fraud and other things, and to respect contracts. So Smith's not an anarchist at all. I'm not an anarchist. And I think Smith's insight, though, is that it's amazing that some things work well that you leave alone. Many things that you leave alone work horribly. Traffic would be one of those, where the property rights aren't there. Places where property rights and competition break down, self-interest is very dangerous. Smith understood that.
So before, I've got a couple more questions.
And we've got to come back and talk about the invisible hidden force that's behind the theory of moral sentiments.
Yeah, give it to us. Let's look at that. Then I want to talk about the...
So in The Wealth of Nations, the invisible force is self-interest combined with competition, and that explains the harmony of our commercial life. In the theory of moral sentiments, it's our desire to be loved and lovely, which keeps us together as friends and family. And so I think in both cases, harmony is what he's trying to understand, and he's finding something that's not obvious, that's not seen directly, that holds the world together.
So really the solution to the Adam Smith's problem is Newton.
Exactly.
What are the nations that he's looking at? You know, wealth of nations. What are the nations that are wealthier, and what are the nations that are poor, and how does he explain?
So the nations that he's looking at that are wealthy are the obvious ones of his day, which were England and France. The United States was just getting started. His book had a big impact on the American founders. Thomas Jefferson was a big fan of it. I don't know what other nations he looked at. I don't remember. But he's very interested also in the very poor nations. And I just want to say one thing about Smith that's important to add to everything we've said. He was a remarkably universalist person for his era. He did not look down, for example, on the Irish, which many English people did, or on what in his day people called savages, in a horrible phrase. He had tremendous respect, and he writes about it quite beautifully, for Native Americans and for Africans who in his day were seen by most people as inferior. He did not see them that way. He didn't see poor people as inferior, which was also a common prejudice people had. There's a beautiful passage about the philosopher and the porter, the thinker and the person who carries things for other people, the porter. And he says they're the same. They're made of the same stuff. They're human beings. So he was a surprisingly modern person in that way.
What are the major lines of criticisms in later economic theory about the wealth of nations?
So, the wealth of nations is, many people would call it the birth of laissez-faire economics, which is related to the invisible hand that we've been talking about. Smith was pretty nuanced. He was not, he was very open to examples that we've been talking about where things broke down. He says, I'm not going to get the quote right exactly, but he says, when business people get together, the first thing they think about is how they can collude, work together to not lower prices because they like high prices. And it's only competition, of course, that keeps prices down. And he very well understood that that's not in the interest of any one business person. So they're obviously going to look for ways to take advantage of people. There's he's not naive in any way. But in his day, the political and policy debates were mainly about free trade and about the role of the sovereign, the role of the king in daily life. Very different from our debates about regulation. There was no large regulatory apparatus the way there is in a modern nation state. So, his policy prescriptions are very simple because it was a simpler time.
Right.
Which is, if I had to put them in a word, I would say, trust the power of self-interest and competition, except when you can't.
but I was thinking of criticism. I was thinking, for example, of Marx, who obviously read and was influenced by Adam Smith. But what do you make of the Marxist critique of?
Well, the Marxist critique,
the hidden hand.
So Marx is worried about exploitation,
right?
And he's writing in the 19th century. There's a big debate in economics right now about how exploited workers were in the 19th century. There's a lot of people believe that the wages of workers in the second half of the 19th century were relatively stagnant while profits were growing for the capitalists, and that's going to drive Marx's vision of reality. There are other people who believe actually it wasn't that bad. There was actually a lot of wage growth, more than we think. It's a measurement issue. But certainly in the 20th century, we see extraordinary prosperity delivered by the forces that Smith cared about. So, Smith would change some of his prescriptions if he saw the modern world. I think Marx would too. Right. So, Marx was worried about when there isn't competition. And that's where exploitation is real. So I think if you want to be fair to both of them, you could say Smith is a half full, the glass is half full, and Marx is it's half empty, and maybe they'd adjust when they got to see more data and more history unfold.
But this is, I think, maybe it goes back a little bit to the conversation we had a moment ago about whether when we do economics, we should think of a field of study that is descriptive or prescriptive. And I find that sometimes these things are confused. People describe the way things work, and I don't think that necessarily should be an ideal. As in, it's not because biology is XYZ and Darwin is right that we have to adopt as human beings. We have a moral guide, and we could have a descriptive economics that doesn't guide our prescriptive policies.
So in general, economists have gotten more prescriptive over the last 250 years. And I think part of the reason is if you are only descriptive, you don't get as much attention. People aren't going to pay attention to you. Politicians are not going to ask for your advice. So the economist who says, I don't know, I'm not sure, is not going to get a good job.
Right.
And I think that's a tragedy. I actually think economists have way too much policy power. I think they have very limited ability to talk about human flourishing and the aspects of the human experience that can't be measured. So I think you're right. I agree with you completely, but we're in a minority opinion in the modern world. Most economists are very
final question.
Yeah.
Professor Roberts. How can Adam Smith change your life? I know I'm going to get the full answer this weekend, but for our audience, how can Adam Smith change your life?
Well, after I read The Theory of Moral Sentiments, I learned a lot about it. Focuses your mind on how you move about in the world, how you interact with other people, how you speak to them, how you treat them, and I think that's a very powerful and useful thing. He sensitizes you to the fact that you are in a social network. And I wrote my book for people who didn't want to go back to 1759 and read Old English, and I modernized some of his examples. I think he's an example of the power of reading. I'll bring this back to my job here as president of Shalem College.
Yes.
Here at Shalem College, I think you said in your introduction that we read books.
Right.
Which is very unusual.
From the very first page until the very last, for some reason.
Yeah, and we don't read a lot of excerpts or a paragraph. We don't read what other people say people believed. We actually encourage our students to read the real books. And we believe, and this is, I think, unique to Shalem in many ways, that when you have a exploration of a great text, sitting alongside people who also want to understand its significance, and which is what a great classroom is, you're transformed. You don't just learn what Adam Smith thought, you internalize it in a way you wouldn't if you were listening to a lecture about Smith, which is ironic because we're doing this right now. We're talking about Adam Smith. We're not reading his works, actual works. I wrote a book to save you the trouble of going through it. But the best thing is to go through the real book, is to read it from the first page to the last.
And I like to think of this series of conversations we are doing here as a key to these castles, to these beautiful and amazing palaces that are the great works of literature that we talk about.
It's a beautiful idea. I heard one of our alumni recently speaking to a group of high school students, and she described that when she first got into Shalem College, we send our students a copy of the Iliad. So, I don't know if we do this every year, but sometimes we send them the Iliad by Homer. And she said she was so excited. She threw a little party for herself. She'd gotten into Shalem. She was so excited. She's going to read great books. And she opens the Iliad. She can't understand a word of it. And she starts thinking, oh, my God, I'm going to be doing this for years. I'm not going to make it. I'm not going to survive. I'm not going to graduate. And she said, but by the end, she gained the key, the word you used, to open any book. And that is a great gift.
Right.
And I encourage our listeners to read The Theory of Moral Sentiments and read The Wealth of Nations. You can skip section 5 on silver. It's very hard to read for a modern person. So you don't have to literally read every page, but don't just take a few highlights. Read the real books, and you thereby gain a skill. This is what I want to remember. You learn how to speak to dead people.
Right.
This is the greatest pleasure a thinking human being can have. There are many great thoughts and thinkers that are long in the past, and we can still talk to them.
There's this beautiful letter that Machiavelli writes when he's writing The Prince, where he's in exile and his life is bitter and he's living in the mud and he feels completely depressed. But at night he comes back home, he puts on the robes he had as a diplomat, and he spends time with the ancients.
That's beautiful.
Professor Russ Roberts, this has been a wonderful, amazing pleasure. Thank you so much for giving us your time and so generously sharing your wisdom. I think that all students here at Shalem are blessed to have a president as hip as you are, a rap artist. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jeremy.
And thank you to all audience. Let's switch back to Hebrew as we do. תודה רבה לכם. אני מקווה מאוד שנהנתם מהפרקים שכבר הקלטנו, מאלה שבעזרת השם נמשיך ונקליט. ומה אני אגיד לכם בינתיים? רק אהבה רבה, קריאה של ספרים מההתחלה ועד הסוף, לא לפחד מהספרים עצמם, כמו שאמר פרופסור רוברטס, רק בריאות ונשתמע. פודקאסט.